Hello, I'm Davina William and welcome to WinZone Focus. On the programme this week, we mark the passing of one of New Zealand's most influential advocates for the protection of children.
To me, Ron O'Grady is just the most admirable man.
I discovered that abuse of our elderly people happens across cultures. And Andrew Urquhart talks with visiting Indian paediatrician Dr. Kiran Martin about her work amongst the poorest of the poor in the slums. The international child protection community is mourning the recent loss of one of its most influential spokesmen. New Zealander Ron O'Grady was instrumental in setting up the global organization ECPAT, an NGO devoted to putting the safety of children first as a stand against increasing child sex abuse. He campaigned tirelessly to raise awareness of what's been described as the second most profitable criminal activity worldwide, and he encouraged leaders and politicians to acknowledge the magnitude of the abuse and to actively seek solutions. Former head of World Vision New Zealand, Colin Prentice, remembers Ron O'Grady as being a man of vision who inspired many organizations to improve their own guidelines on child safety. Colin Prentice shared his thoughts about Ron O'Grady with Diane Davenport.
Colin, thank you for coming in today. I understand that Ron O'Grady had a significant impact on your life personally and professionally, and we'll cover more about that later. But could you tell me a little bit about how you got to know him?
Well, it was amazing, really. I'd heard about this man for a long time. I was the leader of World Vision in New Zealand, and I knew that this was a real campaigner for good. I mean, in the nicest sense, social justice and all that. But I went to a conference in Stockholm in 1996, and the chair of this congress was Ron O'Grady. And that was just an amazing experience to see a fellow New Zealander chair a huge United Nations and international conference. People from 120 countries, over 1,000 people, on one of the key issues really facing the world. He, as the chair, was one of the key speakers, and there'd been the Queen of Sweden and there'd been people from the United Nations and the host country speaking. And then this man got up, and I'd met him privately beforehand because I was in the New Zealand delegation, and I'd already admired him and liked him and thought, man, he is doing great work. But he got up and his speech went something like this: tonight in Asia, 1 million children are going to sell their bodies for sex. And in the course of this conference, which is lasting a week, they're going to have 12 million customers. And then he said, by children, I mean 8 to 18 years of age. And I was gobsmacked. It was a brilliant speech. It was arresting. It was factual. It wasn't very emotional if you think of it, but it was arresting. And that night I decided I had to do something about it. I knelt in my room that night after I'd heard that speech, and I promised God I would do something about it. And I decided that night we would devote a large amount of money from our 40-hour famine the next year. And I realised what it had to be. We were going to establish street children's centres in 4 countries in the world. Now, the details of that all emerged later. But if it hadn't have been for that speech, I look back to that, and that was one of those life-changing experiences. And when I look back on my 7 years at World Vision, those street children's centres are probably some of the best things I've ever done in my life. I opened centres in Cambodia and Mongolia, Papua New Guinea and Mali. They're life-changing. That is, kids, teenagers, rescued from the gutter, rescued from rubbish dumps, rescued from slavery, really. But you can't just be sort of gooey-eyed about this. Unless you can teach a child or a teenager a skill to earn money, they're going to go back to their former life because that produces money, regardless of how we feel about it. And so there was huge educational campaigns that were done, training kids, getting them into useful employment. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't heard a fellow New Zealander make a wonderful speech. An awful speech, but a wonderful speech.
Now, as I understand, you got to meet Ron O'Grady personally.
Yes.
What do you remember about the character of the man?
Well, he was gracious. He was strong. He was political, but in the nicest sense. He built an organisation, a worldwide organisation from scratch. He did it by the grace of God, but with passion, conviction, strength, grace. He had a very good mind. I mean, he was an intellectual, but not in a snobby sense. He was intelligent. I left that conference proud to think a fellow New Zealander could have done all that. And he was humble. He was almost deferential about himself. But the cause was so strong against the commercial sexual exploitation of children. We mustn't underestimate, he got Interpol, tourist associations, governments, non-government organisations, customs officials. They were all at that conference, and I stepped back and thought, gee, this man is great. He's the quintessential New Zealander, a man who sees something that needs to be done and who doesn't say someone else should do it. He says, I'll step up, I'll do something, and what's more, I'll gather a lot of people around me. And that's the thing that I'm in awe of, that he built an organisation from nothing, and it's a worldwide advocacy group which has had immeasurable positive results. And so I'm proud of him. I'm proud to have had just a little bit of time with him at a congress, and I'm so glad that actually I did do something about it. It's a bit like in the Bible, just don't be hearers of the word, but actually be doers. Otherwise you're like a man who's planted your house on the sand, but if you really heard and acted, you're like one who's built your house on the rock. And so, to me, Ron O'Grady is just the most admirable man.
Colin Prentice talking there with Diane Davenport about the significant contribution made to worldwide child protection by New Zealander Ron O'Grady, who passed away a few weeks ago. Still to come, elder abuse amongst immigrants. That story's next.